So my name's Eadley. I'm a technical architect working at Microsoft Technology Centres, based in the UK. I also run the M365 Security and Compliance User Group with Pete Rising, and I'm the hat of grey hat beard, hence the picture with the hat, and apologies for not having one on in person here. So please feel free to reach out to me. I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn. If you've got any questions about this or any other subjects, feel free to link up with me. So we've been on a bit of a journey, not just in the last 18 months around the pandemic, but actually a lot of organisations have been on a much longer journey than that. In the beginning, everything was on-prem, and we basically had a nice big firewall around us to protect us. And that hasn't stayed. We don't have that anymore. So we now have, 94% of organisations using clouds, internet-connected devices worldwide, 7 billion mobile business apps. What does that actually mean? Well, all of those stats really point to the fact that rather than everything being on-prem, they're all over the place. They're in applications, they're in services, they're on mobile devices. All of our content is now everywhere. So we really need to start thinking about how we can actually protect it. And when we look at this, and then we actually bring into account, when we used to work in the office, I was speaking to a client a couple of days ago, before the pandemic, they were working in the office 8 till 6, and that was it. They had no mobile devices, no VPN, no way to access any content. This really has changed. All of a sudden, everybody switched on Teams. Whether they did it right or wrong is irrelevant now, but they switched it on and they started distributing content without necessarily really thinking about where that content was going to end up, what devices they were going to use. So we now have this new situation where people are going to be working wherever they're working. And one of the key things here is, well, what devices are they using? I was asked before the session, what was the biggest challenge for me? And I said, finding space to work. Luckily I already had devices. I had a work laptop, it was BYOD laptop, but that immediately presents challenges around how an organisation can actually manage their content. So we do have an approach for this, and I'm sure you've probably all heard of the term, but zero trust is something that, where we are assuming breach, we are assuming that everything's at risk, and we are validating at every given point where we can do to make sure that we actually are checking and not assuming that somebody is entitled to see what they're seeing or do what they're doing. So the architecture that we have for this is quite complex. There's a lot of different elements in it. So we have identities, we have devices, and we have all of our content. So all of these things play together. They all come together to give us a zero trust approach. And we do need particular technologies in place to enable this to actually come to life and for it to be effective. So in this session, I'm not going to cover all of that, because all of that I would cover it at about a level 50 and it really wouldn't be very useful. So I'm really just going to focus into one area of that, which is really crucial for this to work, which is how do we classify, label and encrypt content? And when we're looking at this, if you have worked in the UK or worked with clients in the UK, then you've probably come across GDPR. In Europe, you've got GDPR as well. And when GDPR came out, we started to look at, well, actually, what do we actually need to do? We need to know our data. We need to know where it's stored. We need to know what content it has. And only once we can do that, then we can start to look at protecting our data, preventing data loss, retaining it, getting rid of it when it needs to be, so we can actually really govern it. So we need to know our data first. We need to be able to identify data based on its location and based on its content. And that might be inside our organisation, that might be outside, on BYOD devices, on external client devices, in external locations. So when we're really looking at how do we actually know our data, what does that actually mean? It means that we really need to discover it. We need to be able to find our data, regardless of where it's being stored, and identify it and classify it in a certain way. So if we think about what that means, that might mean, excellent, I've got a SharePoint site. All of that content is to do with HR. I can secure that. I can prevent people actually moving it. I'm not really looking then about the data and what's in that content. I'm looking at where it's stored. Now, what happens if I have a sensitive document that I actually need to share internally within the organization. You know, we're all got that lovely share button now, share internally, share externally, invite guest users in. All of a sudden, I'm giving lots of people access to my content. And it doesn't become based on location, where it's stored. It becomes based on, are they allowed to download it? What can they do with it when they download it? Where are they going to store it? Are they going to copy it and distribute it to other people? So all of these factors play into, actually, we want to know what's in the content. We want to know, is this document important to us, regardless of where it's stored? So whether it's stored in the HR site where it's supposed to be, or is it stored in somebody's OneDrive where it's not supposed to be stored? And how do we actually start to police that? So we have tools to do this. We have a lot of tools. And most of these tools, yes, you have to pay for them, but it's worthwhile. So when we look at what we've got in terms of the tooling that we have available to us, we've got at the bottom there, manual classification. I want to actually apply a label. I want to choose how I'm going to retain it. I want to choose how sensitive it is. To do that, as a user, I need to understand A, what those labels mean, what the impact of them is, how to use them, and B, does it match to the content? And do I understand all of the policies and the governance that should be in place to actually make that choice in an educated manner, rather than just saying, oh, it's asking me to do this, I have to do this, I'm just going to click the top one because that is by far the easiest option. So that manual option, it doesn't create an effective classification process. It doesn't mean that we can effectively cover all of our content. So when we look at the things at the top there, we have a lot more options. So we've got location. Well, okay, I do know where it's stored. I can start to classify it based on its location. I can look at the metadata and the properties of that content. So what's around it, where it's being stored, you know, what type of document is it based on the content types maybe, or metadata that we're using to actually classify that document based on what location it's being stored in. But then we get into, you know, keywords and queries and sensitive information types. And this is really looking at inside the document. You know, what have we written into that document? What have we typed in there? When we're starting to look at sensitive information types, there's a lot we can do with those, and I'll go through that in a lot of detail in terms of how that works. But then we also have trainable classifiers as well. So we have things where we're not looking for specific patterns, but we're looking for something, a broader pattern. So we're using AI to actually identify, based on the 10,000 documents we've been given it to train the model, we can say, these other documents match that pattern, and therefore we know that they are the same type of document. And we'll go through that as well. Once we've done all of those things, regardless of where that content is, we can say that we've identified it and we've given it certain criteria so we can then classify it. And based on that classification, we can then implement rules that are going to protect that content or prevent data loss, prevent access to it. So we can choose all of these other things that we're going to do. But the first thing that we really need to do is to classify it. We need to be able to discover our content and do that effectively, taking away the need for users to think about it. And this is really key. You know, we want to make it as easy as possible for every document to be classified when it needs to be. Take away the need for users to interact with it. So how do we classify content? So we've got quite a few different options. So the easiest one is the sensitive information types. You've probably come across these in the past, you know, credit card number. It's a nice simple pattern that we can use, and we can say, well, if it meets this pattern, there's built-in functions that will actually do a check and go, is this a valid pattern? Yes, okay. And then we have trainable classifiers. As I say, that's looking more around, you know, is it a resume? Is it code? Can I actually interpret the content of the whole document and say this matches a set of contents that I've trained the AI to identify? So two different ways that we can do this. Now, just a quick show of hands for the people in the room. How many of you have actually used any of these to do automatic classification of content in your environments? So for everybody who's online, there's about 3 hands have gone up out of about 20, 25 people. So This is really underused, and this is really where there is a lot of potential to actually help your organisations identify some of this content. So let's go into this in a bit more detail. The sensitive information types, there's quite a lot of them that are in place. And when you look through, I think it's up to about 250 out-of-the-box sensitive information types. So out-of-the-box patterns that are in place that will help you just quickly and easily choose how you actually identify content. So that might be country related, so PII data, personal information. So you might have, starting alphabetically, I think Argentina comes at the top, and there's passport numbers and driver's licenses. And then you've got those for pretty much every country. You've got credit card numbers, SWIFT codes, financial patterns and data that's commonly used throughout a lot of organizations. So those out-of-the-box ones, Microsoft are putting those in, and they can group them together as well. So you can just go, I want all the PII data, boom, done. Make it really simple to put together. We then have the ability to use custom. And I'll go through this in more detail, but the custom is basically using a combination of regex expressions to identify patterns, but then supplementing that and trying to minimize the potential of having false positives by saying, okay, a regex pattern near something else, or in combination with other patterns in the same document. So we can build these out and make them quite sophisticated just to define our sensitive information types. And then the last one that's up there, the exact data match. This one is really about actually using line of business data. How do we actually take, our CRM system and go, well, we've got a list of clients and client IDs. How do we use that data to actually identify in content and say, I've got my 8-digit number, it means 6 different things in my organization. But if I find it in combination with this name, then I know that it refers to a client. So this is really where we're starting to integrate other sources of information to minimize the amount of false positives we have. So to make sure that we have higher confidence in the matching that we have. The trainable classifiers, so again, we've got out-of-the-box trainable classifiers. Microsoft are currently working on finding out what other out-of-the-box trainable classifiers are needed, but we have things like resumes and code in there, and harassment and language. So there's various things that are in there that you can apply, and it will go through and find all of the content that matches the overall pattern of those classifiers. Okay, so when we look at the sensitive information types, I'd said regex, but we can also do keywords. If there are key things that we want to find, we can do that. So if you think about, you might have a set of project names that are sensitive, and you actually want to use those, or particular labels that you're using in your organization to identify things. You can put keywords in, you can put dictionaries, which are larger, in there as well. So we've got different ways that we can actually use these and say, we want either keywords, regex, or dictionary. And then we can actually build out from there. So with all of those, we can put those supporting elements in. How many other factors do we have? Proximity. Can I find this word next to this particular pattern? How close do they have to be for it to be a positive match? As I said, the out-of-the-box tools that we've got, national identifiers, health identifiers, finance. So we've got a lot of these already in place that you can just use. Okay, so I'm going to do a demo. This is all slide-based, so I'm not risking live because this stuff takes ages to set up and test, and it's a minefield. So in here, we're in the admin center, and what we're going to do is so this is the compliance admin center. We're going to go into the data classification screen. So in here, we have several different things in here. Across the top there, we've got overview, we've got trainable classifiers, sensitive information types, exact data match. And so we're going to go into the sensitive information types. So in here, you can see we've got all of these out-of-the-box ones. So you've got ABA routing number. I've never worked out what that one is. I'm sure somebody knows what that one is. But we've got all sorts of things in here. Half of them, probably more than half, you'll never use, but certainly there'll be some that'll be related to either your industry or your country. We have the ability to search, which is really useful. So especially if you're putting custom ones in, think about how you're going to name them, because if you search for them, you can then get your group of identifiers really quite easily. So I'm going to go through several scenarios here and just sort of explain how we build up the use of the regex expressions and the different combinations of other supporting elements. So we're going to start with an account number, and in there, what we see when we select that is we get this panel on the right hand side, and that will give us an overview of what's in there. And we're going to click into edit and to look at this account number. We have a name, we have a description, standard stuff, and when we click next, we go through and we can see the patterns. Now, remember, this is just one information type that we're looking at. So when we're in here, we can see that we've got a primary element and we've got character proximity there. So if we click on edit, we're going to go in and we're going to see our pattern. So this is really the nuts and bolts of a sensitive information type. What are we actually trying to find in a document? In here, we've got primary element and it's a regex. So if I click into that, we'll get a standard sort of regex expression where we can put it in. And we can put validators in there and we can build up that regex expression. Now, in this scenario, we've got an 8-digit number. I've worked with a lot of clients who, for one reason or another, use 8-digit numbers. And they might use them for multiple things. So some cases, they'll look at this and they'll go, yeah, that's okay, I can do that. And if I click next, I can see my 8-digit number. I'm going to put it as medium. I'm not necessarily making it high confidence because it might not be the right thing. So this is where we're trying to say, what is our expectation of false positives surrounding this particular pattern? When we go next on this, we have our settings and we save it and we're done. And so it's really quite easy to set these up. What we then want to do is want to test it. So in that edit panel on the right hand side where we're seeing the details, we have the ability to test. And this is really useful because it gives us the option to actually upload a file. So if we've got sample data, test data, where we know we've got positive or negative matches coming out, we can do the upload file. It will allow us to browse a particular file. In this case, I have a sample which has got three 8-digit numbers in it. When I go through from there and I do the test, it's going to go off. It takes a few seconds and then it's going to come back and it's going to go, oh, okay, I've found all of these items. Excellent. So we can see what our matches are. So we can test this. Now, client that I had that had 8-digit numbers, they had them both for properties and for tenants. Kind of makes it a little harder to work out which is which. So one of the things that we want to do is to say, those false positives, how do we reduce the likelihood of those false positives? And this is where we really have to build on, well, actually our 8-digit number is great, but. So if we come in, we might want a descriptor in there. So we're going to come back into this and go back into edits, go through, but this time we're going to say, we want to say it's near certain words. So when we do this, we're back into editing, but we've got supporting elements for this one. And what we're actually doing here is where you've got that supporting elements about 2/3 of the way down, we're going to click on that and we're going to add in particular statements in there. So we're going to say if it's close to account number or AC number or AC hash, we're going to put those in. So those are qualifiers to reduce the amount of false positives that we have. So when we do that, we then want to test it again. So we're then going to test it with our document again, and we get no matches. So our 3 8-digit numbers, they come up with no matches. Excellent. We know that's kind of what we want. If we test it with another document, then what we're going to do here is we've got account number in there. So we're going to click on that and test that, and that comes up and says yes, and we have supporting elements to say we've got account number in here. We can see why we've actually got that positive match. So that's great. We can say our 8-digit numbers where we're using them in different ways. If we have descriptors that we want to apply to them, we can actually reduce our false positives there. So we could have a low confidence one that's just the 8-digit number, but a medium confidence one that has the descriptors in there. And it will go for the medium one rather than the low one. There's a question at the back?
Yeah.
Hang on.
Yeah. Have the flying red box.
Thanks. Are there bounds for the proximity? Like, is it within the same document, within the same paragraph?
Same document.
Just
so you
same
can
document.
put the number of characters to say how far away. So by default it's about 300 characters. So you could be saying yes if it's within 50 characters to get them right next to each other.
Thanks.
Excellent. Okay, so let's think about patterns. Patterns are great. Regex is great. I hate regex, by the way. The only thing that is worse than regex is CSS. But regex is great for finding a pattern. So if I look at the UK postcode, it's quite standard. So I've got a regex pattern that will find that UK postcode. There's particular combinations, and we know what the structure of them is. So I can put that in there. We can go next. Again, I can test it, and I can test it with a document that has those standard defined patterns. Now, all of these examples are not legitimate postcodes. So how do I then think about, well, that's great, I've got all of those, but how do I again make it better? So if I'm thinking about reducing false positives, I need to think how I can tie that down. Regex isn't necessarily going to do it, or it's going to be a massively long, complex regex pattern. So there are other ways that we can actually make this easier. We can put additional checks in. So at the bottom here, we've got an additional check that we've put in. Now for UK postcodes, you can actually look it up and find all of the starting characters. And I can basically pull those down, I can drop those in. So I basically have a list of all of the starting 2 character combinations and 1 character combinations that are legitimate for UK postcodes. So rather than making a really big and ugly regex expression that has all of those in there, I have a nice simple list that I put in. And when I save that and I test that, again, I'm going to have no positive matches because all of those XYZ ones aren't legitimate. But when I test it with some legitimate postcodes, then I will get that coming up and they will all come through and be successfully matched. So really what we're doing with all of these sensitive information types like this, we're trying to minimize the amount of false positives to make us more confident that every time any automated application using these is going to be accurate and is going to be successfully applying the right label, the right retention policy, the right protection on our content, rather than having false positives where users go, whoops, you've put it on Swift code and we all send Swift codes out in invoices. So, you really need to make sure that whatever you're applying here is successfully applied and appropriately applied for your users. Now that's great. We'd love those 8-digit numbers. We love the regex expressions. They all work really well. But what about business information? Common question. Well, I've got a list of clients in my CRM system. That's what I want to protect. I know their names. I know their dates of birth. I know their identifiers in our CRM system. How do I do that in our content? Sensitive information types, as I've just shown you, won't do that. So we need to step it up a bit and do something else. So in this scenario, we want to say Dynamics 365, for example, we want to create a sensitive information type from content that is coming from our Dynamics system. And this is where exact data match comes in. And exact data match, I haven't seen it used in that many clients yet. It's quite new, it's developing, it's only got a UI earlier in the year. Before that, it was just PowerShell, so not easy to set up. And, I'll be honest, there are still things that I would like to see done to it to make it better and easier to use. But the way exact data match works is that basically you extract data from your system, you put it into a CSV file, and then you upload it. And you upload it into a defined schema. You can hash it as it's going up to secure it, because obviously it might have very sensitive information. And you can upload up to 100 million rows, which is quite an impressive number of rows if you're going to actually be finding, if you've got that many customers, you're probably doing pretty well. So really what we're trying to do here is to actually set up a process where we can import that data, use that data, and then actually use it in the information types. So back from our data classification page, we have an option at the top, which is exact data match. When we click in here, we see two things on the left there. We see the EDM schema and the EDM sensitive information type. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to create our schema, which is going to define from our CSV file what columns we're actually going to use. And then we're going to define how those columns are going to be used. So what are we searching for? How are we matching? And then we'll create a sensitive information type based on that EDM data, which will then be available for us to use in our other, in the same way that the other sensitive information types are. So we're going to click into this one. And what we can see here is we've got our schema, and at the bottom there, we've got rows there that actually show the columns that we're using. So we've got account number, we've got organization, title, name, description, and some of those we can use to search, and some of them are supporting elements. So this is really important to think about. What do I want to find in my documents? And then what supporting information do I want to use to validate that it is a positive match? So we're going to go into this one. When we're looking at the EDM schema, basically what we have here is a set of columns. So fields. So we've got field 1, we can put the name of it, we can set it to be searchable, and we can set it as case sensitive if we want. So we have some options around that. We can choose delimiters that we want to remove. So where you might have an inconsistent use of a dash in phone numbers, you could say, right, well, let's remove all of these factors so that we're actually condensing it down and making it easier to match. And then we can actually put in custom delimiters and punctuation to move. And basically, we go through and we set up multiple columns in here. And then when we've got all of those done, then we'll save that, and that will give us our schema. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the upload because it is really actually quite dull. You download an exe, believe it or not, it's not PowerShell or anything nice like that, and you run it on a specific machine, and it takes about half an hour to upload. And once you've got that data in, at the moment, you can't actually see all of that data and see how well it's been populated, which is one of my bugbears about it. But once you've got that data in, the next thing that we want to do is to define how we're going to use that data. So we want to then define patterns. So when we're defining this, we've chosen our schema that we're going to use, and now we're going to actually choose, the conditions that we're using. So when we go into edit here, the first thing that we get is we get our confidence level. How confident are we? I don't know why that's the first question. We should be a bit more confident on this now, but so we'll put it as medium confidence. We then have that primary element. Now that primary element is really important because that's the thing that we're going to be looking for in our documents, in our content, which is then going to trigger us to have a look at all of this other information. Now, it may be a great idea that you can just search for, I want to see all of my customer names, but you can't actually do that in this. You have to have something, because the next section down is saying, well, actually, what's the sensitive information type for my primary element? So we have to have a standard sensitive information type that correlates with our primary element here. So where we're looking at that 8-digit number, we could be using that. So in this case, I've got my account number, which is the one I was doing before, which is just looking for the 8-digit number. That's the sensitive information type that's actually going to trigger this particular EDM sensitive information type. We then have supporting elements. So you can see in the next one down, what other things do I want? Well, I want to have my name and organization. So those are textual. Those are things that we're going to then go, I've got my 8-digit number. Do I have any of these other things in here? What we then have is, well, actually based on that, how many of those do I actually want to match? And does it matter if I have all of them or just one of them? Now, it might be that you're saying, I've got this ID number, but I've got the name of the organization, and that's sufficient for me to identify this content as needing to be classified or protected in some way. It might be that I'm looking for my name as well. It might be either of those. So in this scenario, we've got both of those elements, and I've said that I want between 1 and 2 of those matching. So at least 1 up to 2. So that means that I can match on either of those, which is a really important element if you've got multiple validation points that you can put in there to say, if it's the name, if it's the date of birth, then I'm actually finding a match here. So when we go through this and we save this, again, we've got confidence level. Sorry, this is the proximity one and the confidence level. So we've got the confidence level and the proximity. How far away are these matches? Do they need to be right next to each other or not? And then when we go through this, we give it a name at the end. Again, I don't know, consistent UI is not something Microsoft specializes in, so different order for everything. So once we've got this, we can review and finish this. And once we've done that, this then shows up. Now I've ordered here the sensitive information types in the other tab by the type. And you can see that at the top, we've got exact match, and then the others are entity. So this appears in the same list of sensitive information types now, but it's being driven by the exact data match. And so when we order it, we can see them like that. When we, excuse me, when we click on it, we get that same panel come up on the right-hand side, but we don't get all of those options. So we can't edit it from there. We need to go into the exact data match to edit it, but we do have that test option there. So when we test it, we can upload a file. And in this case, I'm going to upload some 8-digit numbers, and we're going to get no matches. The next one, I'm going to update it with some names and numbers, and we're going to get some matches. And I haven't cracked why the supporting elements aren't coming through there, which is really frustrating. But what we're seeing here is we've got one match from those, because one of them, those numbers matches with the name that we had in there. The other number doesn't match because the name isn't correct. So we've got this information coming through now to say, we're matching the identifier, the 8-digit number, and then we're matching the supporting elements that are coming from our line of business application. If we just want to do the organisation, so we've got the organisation there, and we've got 2 numbers, and then that will come up, and both of those numbers come through. So they're both being validated because the organisation is correct. So again, those 2 sides, what do we want to match, one or other, or both of those elements? We can control how many of those supporting elements actually we need. Okay, so trainable classifiers. So trainable classifiers, as I say, they're matching on they describe it as the type of document, but they're looking at all of the content and saying, does all of that content together match the pattern that we've been trained on? And we do need to train it, so you do need to have quite a lot of documents to actually pass through to create a new trainable classifier. It gives you a lot of options about how to do that, but it says about 10,000 documents, which is probably quite a lot of documents to match on something. The things that are in there out of the box: resume, source code, harassment, profanity, and threat. So all of those are in there as out of the box trainable classifiers. When you're actually starting to use this, it does take a bit of time to actually get it working and to make sure you've got the right things in place and the right test documents as well. So this all works really nicely, especially when you're using automated classifiers. So again, we're going to go in here, trainable classifiers. And what we see then is our list of trainable classifiers. Now, I gave you about 5 options there of the types, but obviously we've got lots of languages here. So if you're multinational, you need to train them in each of the languages to pick them up. It won't automatically do with the translation and everything. So that's why there's a lot more in here than just the single types, because you do have the different languages. So to show you this, what I've done is I set one of these up and I have it auto-classified. So when I set up a document in Office, it immediately comes up and it says at the top there, policy tip, your organization automatically applied the sensitivity label confidential/resume. And that's where you use these trainable classifiers to do that automated classification, because it's looking at all of the content. So it comes up and it automatically comes up in Word when you've got that set up. You'll see that actually it is in there, confidential resume. So that's all set up and all used, which is, it makes it easy for those trainable classifiers to be used, but it is only automated application of them. So how do we see what's going on? We've set up all of this wonderful stuff. One of the things that we really want to do is to understand actually how many times are these labels being used? Where are they? So we have two things in here. One, we've got the Content Explorer. Now, as with everything to do with accessing content, you need to have the right permissions. Content Explorer is no different. If you've ever used eDiscovery, it's very similar. You've got specific permissions that need to be in place to access content, because essentially this interface is knocking down all of the security walls across your tenant. So you don't want many people having this permission. So if I go into this, in this particular scenario, I'm a global admin. I have no additional permissions. So theoretically, I'm God. I can do anything. So I can see for this particular label, New Zealand driver license, which is the most popular one in this tenant for some reason. Probably a lot of false positives, I suspect, because I don't suspect we've got many New Zealand driver's licenses in here. Lots of kittens in there, yes. Yes, one of my colleagues likes testing with kittens. That sounds really wrong, doesn't it? So in here, we can see for this particular sensitive information type, and you get this out of the box, you'll see all of the content that potentially matches these. You can see Exchange has a lot of them. If I click on my one, then I will see that, and I can see where the information is. If I click on OneDrive, for example, and I go to click on that, I will see, I will see that if I try and actually drill further down other than the service where it's being stored, I will get a message saying I don't have the right permissions. So you need to allocate additional permissions even to global admins to make sure they have the compliance permissions to actually see all of this content regardless of where it is. And if you think about OneDrive, you know, that's going to be your CEO, for example. So you really need to think carefully about how far you want to go with this and who has the permissions to do this. So, but it's great to see that it is locked down by default, but you can still see the services that are being used. So the other element that we have is Activity Explorer. So I can see passively where all the content sits that has been labeled, that has matching those sensitive information types. But actually, maybe I want to see a bit more about where people are actually actively doing things and what they're doing. So with Activity Explorer, if I click into that, then I can see, you know, when things are being labeled. And I can see if I click on one of these and I want to see, well, actually, I've got a file. I can see that some activity has taken place. I can see that the user is me. If I click on that, I actually get quite a lot of information about the item, where it sits, the IP, where I've done things from. So there's a lot of information that we actually get coming out of this to say who has actually done this activity, where have they done it, what does this information look like. So lots of information there around where things, who's doing what. I can also see, you know, files modified, created, copied to the cloud. So there's an overview. It's, again, the UX. Yeah, Microsoft, they're not great on UX, aren't they, where that just jumps out at you with lots of bright colors. But it does give you information about what kind of activity is taking place in your tenant. Now, one of the really useful things about this particular area is you can go to the filters. And if you go to the filters, you can actually choose to add in an awful lot of other filters in there. So the default filters are all right, but actually if you're really looking for something in detail, there's a lot more filters that you can put in here. So if I add the sensitive information type filter in here, then that will give me a new drop down where I can actually choose, okay, exactly which information type do I want to see. Therefore, I can see all of the activity related to people applying that particular sensitive information type. So if I do that, then I can see that, and I can start to see all of the information in terms of when that information type has been used. I can put in labels in there. I can put in the policies in there that are being used. So there's lots of information that you can see to see how effectively your content is being used. So there's quite a lot there in terms of what that data classification interface offers and ways that you can classify information, identify information based on the content, based on the patterns and the classifiers. So just to sort of refresh, we've got all of these different things, and I'll try to show you quite a few of these. in terms of how they work and how they, the key thing that we're trying to do here is to reduce the false positives. Make sure that our classification is actually finding the right content so that then, we can apply our labels, we can apply our policies, we can retain content, etc. Now, the one that I haven't mentioned here is syntax. And syntax, again, like the classifiers, the trainable classifiers, can be used to apply labels, can be used to apply information. But that's just in SharePoint. That's not necessarily thinking about Exchange. And, when we're looking at syntax, it's a whole separate interface. It'd be lovely if it all came into this interface. And it's very similar to the classifiers in terms of your training content. You're looking at what's in there and you're using AI to identify content within SharePoint. So do check out SharePoint syntax if you're not familiar with how that can be used for classification as well. So just to recap quickly, when we're looking at all of these tools that we have, that automated block really is the key thing that we want to be looking at. We want to take away the need for users to really think about, how do I tell whether this information is important to my organization? How do I go through this interface and choose all of these retention labels? How do I do that? We don't want users to have to think about that. We want to be automating this as much as possible so that we're not relying on users to do that. Most organizations, when they look at the manual options, they will be using it in a very small area of their organization to say, okay, HR, we know where that content is. We want to block it. We want to lock it all down in this particular area rather than worrying about the whole sort of remit of where content is going to live. So, we've got different options for how we can actually classify things. Think about this in your organization. What are the patterns of content in your organization that you think would be reliable to be able to be used for classifying information? And that's really important. Organizations where you've got an 8-digit number used in 3 different ways, you're going to really have to think, is that worthwhile, or are you going to get more false positives than you need? Or are there qualifiers that you can actually put in to ensure that you have accurate classification? Think about that line of business data. Can you use that to actually qualify your data, to make sure that you've got different criteria that you can bring in, different components that you can match? Will that help? The line of business applications, if they store the content, maybe that's where you need to be classifying it. So you need to think about where that content lives as well. And then thinking about the types of content, code or resumes, are quite straightforward ones to do. Thinking about where those live, resumes in particular, they get distributed. All right, so line manager, can you have a look at this resume for this candidate? Oh, they're just going to store it in their OneDrive. Excellent. That's not the right place to store it, especially if you've got to, comply with GDPR and things like that. So really thinking about some of these is important to think about where that content is in your organization. So with that, we've got time for some questions. Are there any questions? There's a question here, red box to the man in the middle.
I don't know where to go. Yeah.
So the exact data match where you're uploading your line of business data, was that a one-off upload?
No, so
it is a link. So as you put more data in it, or
and you need to set that up yourself. So it's not as slick a process as I would like it to be. So it is, you set it up on a machine, you download an executable, you can set it up on 2 machines if you want to hash the content and sort it to send it all up. But it's command line. So it's not exactly the most slick process, but it does upload content pretty quickly. And once it's up there, you can use those information types really effectively.
Cool, thank you.
Oh, another question there. We'll come to you in a second, Adam.
In terms of licensing, what are we talking about? Because in the beginning you said there might be some extras.
There will always be extras. There will always be extras. So the simple rule is, if you want anything automated, you need to get an uplift in the licensing. So you can have the E5 compliance uplift. If you've got M365 E3, you can get the E5 uplift for compliance or full E5 for Office 365. So it's all in that E5 level, but there is a compliance uplift that you can get on top of M365.
Okay.
But yes, you always have to pay for it. The automation is the key thing. That's the key decider. There's a bunch of other stuff that you'll get with that compliance uplift. So when this is important for your organisation, if you're regulated, there'll be a lot of benefits there.
All right, I think I had the same question as asked previously, but let's see if I got this correct. With the exact data match, and when you set up this kind of upload, is it like syncing changes, or do you have to do that manually when
it's not. So it's not syncing, it's push. So you'd set it up to download your content into a CSV and then push that content up into exact data match. So it's not dynamic, and it's not syncing changes automatically. It's just you're pushing up a new CSV, and then it will update records that are already up there.
Do you know if that's something that's in the works? Because if you have, like, for example, have customers in Dynamics 365, every single time you get new customers, you have to do that kind of upload.
Yeah, so you'd need to be doing that sort of on a regular basis. I don't know if there's anything in the works that's going to automate that. There are scripts that you can set up. So they do have scripts in the exact data docs.com for exact data match to schedule it so that it will run every day. But it's not there's no automated integration with anything else. You still need to kind of build the process to generate that CSV, and then you could be using a standard job just to run it every day.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Any questions online? They have to raise their hands. Oh, if you're online, you have to raise your hand. Very polite, aren't you? In Teams, yes. Good call, in Teams.
No questions.
No questions? Okay. Well, in that case, I hope you found it useful. Please do submit feedback in the event app, and please do feel free to reach out and ask any questions if you think about it afterwards.
Thank you very much for the session. It was amazing.